Hello and welcome to my workshop. I didn't want to make this video in the first place, simply because there are plenty of fantastic videos out there on YouTube about how to make a river table. And I've seen many of them in order to learn how to do it. And I found it quite difficult to collect all the relevant information distributed all over the entire videos. What I missed was one video which gives you all the important information right in the beginning. And that's what I'm going to do now. So here we go. First thing is first, epoxy resin. For making a river table, you need an epoxy resin suited for casting. And among the products on the market suited for casting, there are again huge differences. And the most important characteristics you should take into consideration are the pot life, the maximum casting thickness per pour, and the mixing ratio. Additional favorable characteristics which might be interesting are a good UV resistance and certain self-degassing capabilities. Pot life refers to the time it takes until the resin starts to cure. The product I used gave me a workability time of 24 hours, so way enough time to prepare and pour the resin. As far as the maximum casting thickness per pour is concerned, especially for beginners, I recommend to look for a product which gives you the possibility to make one single pour. If this is not possible because the thickness of your project exceeds any limit, then you have to create multiple layers. The best way here is to pour the next layer once the preceding layer has already firmed up, which means that it is not longer liquid but not fully cured, when it is kind of sticky. As far as the mixing ratio is concerned, each product has its own ratio. Simply be aware of that. Resin quantity. In order to determine how much resin is required, you will have to first calculate the volume to be filled with resin, simply by dividing the room to be filled up into a number of rectangles, calculate them separately and add them together. Secondly, with this calculated number, you have two options. If you have the technical data of your product, you can take the density value, which indicates the equivalent amount of gram per cubic centimeter or pound per cubic foot in order to calculate the required total weight. Or second option is to take one of the resin calculators, which can be found online, in order to calculate the required total weight approximately. Either way is fine. Preparing the mold. For the mold I used melamine MDF, and the most important thing here is that the edges are perfectly sealed. Do not rely on a simple screwed connection here, use a sealant. I used a polymer-based sealant and I put the sealant alongside the inner and the outer edges of my container. To prevent the epoxy resin from attaching to the mold, I recommend to apply several coats of release agent before pouring. Do not use a silicone spray here, simply in order to avoid any issues with silicone absorbed by the wood later when it comes to apply any oil or varnish based finish. And I don't recommend to use any kind of plastic foil either, since a plastic foil always tends to leave a bumpy or wave-like texture on a surface of fully cured epoxy resin. Preparing the slabs. I used a chisel to remove any bark or loose parts from the edges. If the edges contain lots of knots, holes or porous areas, it is recommended to seal the edges with a thin layer of fast curing epoxy before main pour. This prevents any air ingress from the wood into the epoxy. As the edges of my slabs have been very solid and non-porous, I decided to not seal the edges before, and this worked out for me quite well. As I planned to slightly overfill the table with epoxy, I applied lines of hot glue along the surface. These will effectively act as barriers and keep the epoxy in place. And what else is very important, to clamp down the boards before pouring. I learned from my experience that it might be a good practice to cover the downside of the boards with tape. Because even if the boards are clamped down, some epoxy might still spread out underneath the boards, which requires a lot more sanding later in order to get rid of all the epoxy attached directly to the wood. Then preparing the epoxy, you need at least 2 buckets. Put the resin in the hardener at exactly the correct mixing ratio in the first bucket and mix it up for the recommended amount of minutes using a mixing paddle. Then put everything in the second bucket and mix it up again for a couple of minutes. After this procedure, you are ready to color your epoxy resin using any color pigment or any other color media in liquid or paste form. Just make sure that the product you're using is suited for coloring epoxy resin. That's all for now. Thank you very much for your attention. Enjoy the speed build if you stay tuned, which is the rest of the video. If you haven't already subscribed to the Tiny Wood Workshop channel, subscribe and hit the bell icon, and see you in the next video.